Senator Tom Cotton. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Good to be on with you.
So let's start with North Korea. We learned earlier this week that they now have the capability to make missile-ready nuclear weapons, and they've actually threatened to strike on Guam. So it's an escalation we haven't seen in this years-long standoff. It seems the U.S. has no good options. So how can we and our allies respond without ending up in some sort of devastating nuclear conflict?
Well, this is the end of the road of a long series of kicking the can down the road that goes back to the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. So President Trump has inherited, as you say, a lot of bad options. But ultimately, you have to make a choice. And I don't think the American people are prepared to live in a world where the Kim regime in North Korea has nuclear-armed missiles that can strike us in the United States, here in Arkansas even. So I think Trump is right to try to increase the military and diplomatic and economic pressure on the Kim regime, especially through China. So it was a very big success at the United Nations a couple weeks ago when the Security Council voted 15-0 to impose new sanctions on North Korea. But now we have to make sure that China and Russia enforces those sanctions. In the meantime, we need to continue to accelerate the deployment of ballistic missile defense systems into South Korea and Japan, and to beef up our own missile defenses on the West Coast to protect our homeland. But just because you've got a series of bad choices doesn't mean you don't have to choose, and the moment of choosing is coming sooner rather than later, I'm afraid.
And what about President Trump's comments this past week that the threats to the U.S. will be met by, quote, fire and fury the world has never seen? Do comments like that threaten the U.S. diplomacy efforts that a lot of lawmakers have been asking for?
Well, North Korea is a different kind of country, and President Trump, I believe, is trying to speak in the language Kim Jong-un will understand. Throughout history, we see time and time again that war often comes not from taking an aggressive posture towards dictators, but encouraging dictators to think they can get away with provocative behavior. Look, the last thing that anyone wants on the Korean Peninsula is an outbreak of war again. But at the same time, if we're not prepared for war, if we're not willing to take these threats seriously, then oftentimes war can become more likely.
And last week, this was a big week for you. Earlier in the month, you stood next to the president as he announced his support for the RAISE Act, which, of course, you co-sponsored. And to give our viewers just a little bit of background here, it would grade people hoping to immigrate to the U.S. on a merit-based system rather than look at their family ties. And it's estimated it would cut legal immigration into this country in half. So let's first get into the politics of all of this. Democrats say this is a non-starter, and even some of your Republican colleagues, namely Lindsey Graham and John McCain, have said that they just don't like it. And analysts have said that it's kind of dead in the water. Even Marco Rubio said it won't pass. So why are all of these people wrong?
Well, many of my colleagues are emotional and opinionated, yet uninformed of immigration in general and our legislation in particular. Those three Republicans you just mentioned obviously tried to pass sweeping legislation in 2013, which failed, thankfully, because it was a bad bill. So I think the right approach is to take common sense, incremental steps to reform our immigration system to benefit American workers and help promote economic growth. That's what the RAISE Act will do. We admit about 1 million immigrants a year to this country. 1 in 15 are admitted because of their job skills, their educational levels, or so forth. My legislation would change that dramatically by focusing on the kind of ultra high-skilled, well-educated immigrants who are most likely to come to this country, not just support themselves and their families, but to pay taxes, not get on welfare, and help create jobs for all Americans, whether they just took the oath of citizenship last month or whether they have ancestors that came over on the Mayflower. We would continue to welcome spouses and minor children of current American citizens. We'd continue to historically average refugee program as well. But what we need to do is have an immigration system that both promotes economic growth and doesn't put pressure on blue-collar wages. That's what our new system would do, and I'm pretty optimistic. I've spoken with President Trump about this. I've spoken with the Democratic leaders about it as well. We're going to sit down and negotiate and try to find common ground, but I'm committed to making this a reality sometime before this Congress is done.
And you've drawn a line between wage stagnation and the increase in immigration in the U.S. over the last few decades. And then back in April, a group of nearly 1,500 economists from across the political spectrum wrote to the president and congressional leaders about the economic benefits of immigration, saying that it's not just good, but necessary. So are you worried at all about some unintended consequences, both in terms of the economy and limiting the ability for migrant families to come over?
So I think there's a pretty clear connection over the last 40 years between the fact that we've had a major surge in immigration that's mostly unskilled and low-skilled, while at the same time Americans with a high school degree or less wages fall. You know, if you work with your hands and work on your feet, if you have the kind of job where you take a shower after work, not a shower before work, you've been struggling a lot in recent decades. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've had a major surge in unskilled and low-skilled immigration in those same years. There's a Harvard professor, George Borjas, who has studied this and said that the link is clear. But I don't think you have to be a Harvard professor to know that the law of supply and demand applies to the labor market, just like it does to any other markets. You know, here in Arkansas, if you grow rice, you cut trees, or you pump oil, you know, more of your product means prices are lower. If we have more unskilled and low-skilled workers in this country, then the wages that you earn for that kind of work is going to be lower. And I think it's time to change that because blue-collar workers have really been taken on the chin for a long time.
And then you and Senator Perdue rolled out this bill 6 months ago, and one criticism focused, you know, not so much on the bill itself, but the timing. After the health care vote failed, some critics said that this was kind of an effort to rally support for President Trump from his base. And so do you feel any pressure personally to deliver a legislative victory for the president after the health care debacle?
No, so the first version of the bill we introduced didn't touch employment-based green cards at all. We only focused on the other three big areas of green cards: family reunification, the refugee program, the so-called diversity lottery. President Trump wanted us to take a look at the employment-based green card system. We modeled this on what Canada and Australia does, who are, you know, considered to have the world's leading model for immigration. And we wanted to introduce this before Congress broke for August, so we could all have a chance to talk about it with folks back home. This legislation is going to take a while. You know, we're in the very beginning stages. I'm just beginning to sit down with Democratic counterparts, so there'll be a lot of other legislative water under the bridge before we can pass this. But if we can, I think it'll make a real difference for working families in Arkansas and all across the country.
Speaking of health care, there's obviously still a lot of dialogue to be had with that as well. You're one of the handful of senators actually working to craft the legislation that eventually became the BCRA. So the public debate over the process behind this bill was almost intense as the policy debate itself, which you were in on. Looking back on it, do you feel comfortable about the way that the Senate legislation was rolled out?
Well, I'm very disappointed that the Senate failed to pass health care reform last month. Obamacare is still failing. Premiums are going up. We're still running above costs. We're going to have to revisit health care in the future. I don't know if that'll be in the coming weeks or months or maybe later this year or next year, but ultimately health care is still too expensive and out of touch for too many Arkansas families. In terms of the process, I, for one, had a lot bigger say in the health care legislation debate than I would have if it had gone to the Health Committee or the Finance Committee, because I don't sit on those committees, and John Bozeman doesn't either. So I actually thought we got a pretty good voice in the process. But now we're going to return back to the Health Committee. I know that the senior Republican and Democrats on that committee are starting to look at incremental steps we can do to try to shore up our health care system until we can pass more sweeping reform. I hope we can do that. I know that we're going to have to try because it's still too big a source of anxiety and too big a cost for most Arkansas families.
And knowing the outcome now of the BCRA, is there anything that you would do differently back then?
I might go back in a time machine and tell some of those Republican senators that were reluctant to vote for it exactly what it meant when it said we wanted to repeal Obamacare. That's ultimately, you know, the problem we had. You know, we had 52 Republican senators and we couldn't get 50 of them to agree on a single proposal. So I think some of my colleagues hadn't fully thought through the implications of the promises they made, or I know this will be shocking to hear. Sometimes politicians make promises they apparently don't intend to keep. But I thought, you know, we did the very best that we could under the circumstances. Healthcare is a very complicated topic. That's one reason why Obamacare has been failing for so long, is it everything under the sun in our healthcare system was good for some people, but for more families, it made things worse.
And like you said, you were fortunate to be able to represent Arkansas and sit in on this debate. But one of the prominent voices sharply critical of the idea of repealing Obamacare without a replacement plan was our governor, Asa Hutchinson. And so how much weight did your conversations with the governor play into your involvement in crafting this legislation?
Governor Hutchinson worked very closely with Senator Bozeman and me. We had a very constructive conversation. I agree with Governor Hutchinson that it wasn't the best approach to repeal Obamacare with a delay to replace it of up to 2 or 4 years. Back in January, I said I would like to see a repeal of Obamacare with a replacement in place immediately. Where we got by July, though, is we simply didn't have the votes for that. And with a new open enrollment season coming, with people seeing, you know, price increases, with networks constricting as well, the best practical approach at the time was to have a repeal with a short-term bridge to where we could find a new system in the future. Obviously, that didn't work in the end either, but sometimes you have to take a half a loaf in the legislative process. In the end, we didn't get any loaf at all because we couldn't find the votes for it. But like I said, we've got to return to health care sooner or later because it's going to be too much on the minds of too many Arkansas families.
Let's move on to another major issue in Washington. You said last week on Face the Nation that you don't expect either a bipartisan plan in the works to shield special counsel Bob Mueller to go far, and there has been ongoing speculation that President Trump wants to fire Mueller and end Russia probe altogether. Do you think he might actually take that step, though?
I think the best thing that President Trump could do, that the special counsel could do, that anyone involved in this is move as quickly as possible to get all the facts and to make conclusions public. That's what we're doing on the Intelligence Committee, where we're also conducting a similar review. We've had public hearings that Arkansans have seen, but we've had many more private hearings. And even while the senators are in their home states this month, our staff are continuing to interview witnesses and review documents. I hope that we can publish an interim report later this year. But I think the best thing for everyone involved is to get out the facts and our conclusions as quickly as possible. And we'll follow those facts wherever they may lead us.
Some have said that that might actually be grounds for impeachment if he did have involvement. What do you think is going to happen?
I think that's getting way ahead of ourselves. You don't want to jump to any kind of conclusions like that before you review all the facts. I mean, even Democrats on the Intelligence Committee have said thus far they've seen no evidence of any kind of wrongdoing on the behalf of Americans during our campaign. Obviously, the intelligence community has concluded that Russian intelligence services hacked into those emails and released them. They ought not to have done that. That's not surprising, though, because Russia has been behaving in that way for decades, and they'll continue to do so. That's why we have to recognize that Russia is an adversary, that Vladimir Putin is not our friend.
And then what about the Attorney General? You released a statement a few weeks ago calling Jeff Sessions, quote, a good man and a fine Attorney General. And that was around the time that the president was tweeting derogatory things about Mr. Sessions in order to possibly be looking at firing him as well. So where does that situation stand in your view now?
Well, Jeff is the Attorney General, and I think he's doing a fine job, and I think he's going to remain the Attorney General. I've spoken with him. I know that the new Chief of Staff, John Kelly, has spoken with him as well. He's doing an excellent job advancing the very promises that Donald Trump made in the campaign, like cracking down on the drug trade and drug gangs, or cracking down on sanctuary cities that take federal money but then won't cooperate with federal immigration agencies. So I think the Attorney General is doing a very fine job, and I'm glad that he's still on the job, and I hope he'll remain there for the duration of the Trump administration.
And then if Trump's, I guess, what could you call it, threats maybe to fire him, would come to fruition, I mean, would that create a divide between the president and congressional Republicans?
Well, Jeff was a senator for 20 years. I only served with him for 2 years, but I became good friends with him, and we have a lot of respect for Jeff. Even the Democrats who disagree with him on a lot of issues still know him to be a good man of highest character. If Jeff leaves the Department of Justice, obviously have to be a new confirmation, and I don't think we're going to find someone that's better than Jeff Sessions. So that's why I hope that he stays on for the duration of the Trump administration.
And we've gotten into some of the nitty-gritty politics and everything, so I think you deserve a fun question. So let's talk a little bit about this long-standing streak that just came to an end. Your staff baseball team defeated Senator Bozeman's, and so it's the first time his team has actually lost in 7 years, so I'm sure this is pretty big bragging rights for you guys. So do you plan to put that trophy somewhere where Bozeman will see it on a daily basis?
We'll prominently display it. I know that John was disappointed that we finally took the title away from him, but after 7 years, it was about time.
Exactly.
I've been wondering if John hires primarily for softball skill.
We'll have to see, right? I should look into that.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Senator Cotton, thanks for joining us. We always appreciate having you on.
Thanks, Jeff.